The cold hit like a slap. Wind whipped through the empty streets as snow fell in thick, silent flakes. Cars rushed past, headlights cutting through the dusk, drivers focused on getting home. No one noticed the shape standing by the roadside, not at first. It was a dog. A German shepherd, fur matted with ice, ribs faintly visible beneath its thick coat. It stood perfectly still, eyes locked on the passing traffic. Not chasing. Not wandering. Just watching. Like it was waiting for something. Or someone. The dog didn't move when a silver SUV slowed down. The driver, an older man with tired eyes and a worn flannel jacket, frowned. There were stray dogs in the city, sure, but this one didn't look wild. It looked desperate. But the kind of desperate that wasn't just hunger or cold. There was purpose in the way it stood, tail low, ears flicking at every passing car. The SUV hesitated, brake lights glowing red through the snow. The driver sighed. Not my problem. It's just a stray. He reached for the gear shift. Then the dog stepped forward, just one shaky step, and locked eyes with him. Something in that gaze stopped the man cold. There was no panic, no aggression. Just quiet, urgent pleading. Like the dog was saying, please. Please don't leave. The driver swallowed hard. The snow was piling up fast. Temperatures were dropping. If the dog stayed out here much longer. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. I can't believe I'm doing this. He pulled over, hazard lights flashing, and stepped out into the freezing air. The dog didn't run. It didn't bark. It stood its ground, shivering but patient, like it had been waiting for this moment all day. Hey, boy, the man called softly, holding out a gloved hand. The dog's ears twitched. It whined, a broken sound that cut through the wind like glass. It took another step closer, then another. The man knelt, heart pounding. You're freezing, he muttered, brushing snow from the dog's back. The fur underneath was damp and icy. How long had it been out here? Come on, he said, standing and motioning toward the warm car. Let's get you out of the cold. But the dog didn't move toward the car. Instead, it took a step back. Barked once, sharp, urgent. Then it turned its head, looking toward the dark woods that lined the edge of the road. The man frowned. What? You want me to follow you? He glanced at his watch. Already late. The warmth of home, a hot meal, and a quiet evening were calling. The dog barked again. One step closer to the woods. And then it stopped, eyes flicking back to the man, tail barely wagging, as if begging him to understand. The man's breath came out in a cloud of mist. He should leave. He should get back in the car and forget this ever happened. But something about the way the dog stood there, silent, unwavering, made his chest tighten. This isn't normal. He clenched his jaw. All right. Lead the way. The dog didn't hesitate. It spun and trotted toward the trees, glancing back every few steps to make sure the man was following. He pulled his coat tighter and stepped off the road, boots crunching in the fresh snow. He had no idea what waited for him in those woods. But one thing was clear, this dog wasn't just begging for help. It was leading him to something, or someone. And somehow, he already knew, turning back wasn't an option. The man hesitated for a moment, standing at the edge of the snow-covered road, watching the German shepherd disappear between the dark, frost-covered trees. The dog moved with urgency, not the aimless wander of a stray, but the determined pace of an animal with a purpose. It glanced back once, eyes sharp, as if checking to see if he was still following. Crazy, the man muttered under his breath, shoving his gloved hands deeper into his coat pockets. Absolutely crazy. The road behind him was still alive with traffic, headlights flashing, tires hissing on wet asphalt. He could have turned back, gotten in his car, and driven away. Any reasonable person would have. After all, it was just a dog. Strays wandered around all the time, scavenging for food, chasing shadows. But this one was different. The man gritted his teeth and stepped off the pavement, his boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunch. The cold bit through his thick socks almost immediately. He wasn't dressed for a trek through the woods, but it was too late to second guess. The dog had already slipped deeper into the trees, weaving between snow-laden branches with practiced ease. "Hey," he called out, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Where are you taking me, huh?" The only response was another bark, sharp, urgent, almost impatient. It sounded less like a warning and more like a plea. "Hurry." With a sigh, he quickened his pace, following the trail of paw prints in the fresh snow. The woods were silent except for the crunch of his boots and the occasional rustle of wind through brittle branches. No birds, no squirrels, just cold, heavy quiet. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, like the world was holding its breath. The dog stayed just far enough ahead to keep him moving, but close enough not to lose sight. Every few seconds, it would pause, look back, and then dart forward again. The man's heart pounded in his chest, not just from the cold but from something deeper. Instinct. That gut feeling that told him something was wrong. Very wrong. "All right, boy," he muttered, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "If I freeze to death out here, this is on you." The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and the light fading faster than it should have. The man checked his watch. Barely past 5, but the thick clouds and falling snow made it feel like night was already swallowing the sky. Suddenly, the dog stopped. Completely still, ears perked, tail stiff. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, nose pointed toward something half hidden by the snow and shadows. The man squinted, stepping closer. "What is it?" "What do you?" Then he heard it. Faint. Fragile. A sound almost swallowed by the wind. A whimper. His breath caught in his throat. He froze, heart hammering in his chest. The dog barked again, louder this time, and took a step forward, glancing back at him with frantic eyes. No. Not just a stray looking for food. Not just a lost pet. Someone was out there. Someone who needed help. The man surged forward, legs moving, before his brain could catch up. The snow, knee-deep in places, slowed his pace, but the dog darted ahead, weaving through the underbrush like it knew every inch of the terrain. "Hello?" the man called out, voice cracking with urgency. "Is someone there?" Another whimper. Closer this time. It wasn't an animal, it was human. Small. Weak. The dog reached the far side of the clearing and stopped beside a cluster of fallen branches, half buried in snow. It barked twice, pawing at the frozen ground. The man stumbled forward, heart racing. And then he saw it, a tiny hand, pale and still, barely visible beneath the branches. Oh my God. He dropped to his knees, brushing snow away with shaking hands. Beneath the fragile covering of branches and frost lay a child. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, curled into a ball, her cheeks flushed red with cold, eyes half-lidded and glassy. "Hey! Hey, kid," the man shouted, panic rising like bile in his throat. He shook her shoulder gently, afraid of hurting her, but terrified she wouldn't respond. "Can you hear me?" The girl's eyes fluttered. Lips blue. Breath shallow. She tried to speak, but only a faint, broken whisper escaped. The dog whined, circling anxiously, its body tense as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Okay, the man muttered, shrugging off his coat without thinking. He wrapped it around the girl, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, light as air, fragile as glass. How long had she been out here? How had she survived this long? He glanced at the dog, who stood beside him, panting but focused. It had led him straight here. If he'd driven past, like everyone else, the thought made his stomach twist. "We've got to get her out of here," the man said aloud, more to himself than the dog. Fast. But the woods stretched dark and endless around them, and the snow had already begun to fill in their footprints. He turned in a slow circle, disoriented. Which way was the road? His car? The dog barked again and took off, not toward deeper woods, but at an angle, following a barely visible path through the trees. Without another thought, the man followed, cradling the girl close to his chest, feeling the faint rise and fall of her breath against his heart. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured, pushing through the snow as fast as he could. "Just hang on." The minutes stretched endlessly, each step harder than the last. The cold bit into his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. The only thing that mattered was the fragile life in his arms, and the dog that refused to let them fall behind. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the trees thinned. Headlights flashed in the distance. The road. Civilization. Safety. The man stumbled onto the shoulder, legs burning, lungs screaming for air. He waved frantically at the nearest car, shouting until the driver slammed on the brakes and rolled down the window, eyes wide with shock. "Call an ambulance," the man gasped, holding the girl tighter. "Now." The driver fumbled for their phone, face pale. The dog stood beside them, chest heaving, tail still and low. Silent. Watchful. As sirens wailed in the distance, the man glanced down at the girl's face, her breath barely visible in the cold air. He didn't know who she was, where she'd come from, or how the dog had found her. But one thing was clear. If he hadn't stopped, if he'd ignored that silent, desperate plea from the side of the road, the girl would have been another nameless tragedy, lost to the cold. And no one would have ever known. The man's throat tightened. He reached down, brushing snow from the dog's fur. "You saved her," he murmured, voice breaking. "You saved her life." The dog didn't wag its tail, didn't bark in triumph. It simply sat beside the man and the child, silent as the snow continued to fall around them. Waiting. Always waiting. Because its job wasn't finished yet. Not until the girl was safe. Not until someone understood why she'd been out there alone. And what, or who, she'd been running from. The ambulance lights flickered through the falling snow, casting ghostly shadows across the empty road. The man stood beside the paramedics, his arms now empty, watching them carefully lift the girl onto a stretcher. The warmth of his coat still wrapped around her small frame. She hadn't said a word since he found her, just the faintest whimper, a sound so fragile it felt like it might shatter in the cold air. The German shepherd stood by his side, silent and alert. It didn't flinch when the ambulance doors slammed shut or when the paramedics started talking in clipped, efficient tones. The dog's eyes stayed locked on the girl, as though its job wasn't done yet. "Sir," one of the paramedics said, snapping the man out of his daze. "Do you know this child? Is she yours?" The man blinked, shaking his head. "No." He glanced down at the dog, the image of those pleading eyes on the roadside flashing through his mind. "I found her. Or, the dog found me. Led me to her. She was half buried in the snow, freezing to death." The paramedic frowned, scribbling on a notepad. "Do you know how long she might have been out there?" "Hours, maybe longer." The man rubbed his hands together, trying to chase away the lingering cold. "She's lucky to be alive." "Lucky," the paramedic muttered, shaking his head. "More like a miracle." The man didn't argue. It was a miracle. He'd almost driven past. One glance the other way, 1 second's hesitation, and that girl would have been another tragic story on the evening news. Child found frozen in woods, too late to save. But they weren't too late. Not yet. The ambulance pulled away, tires crunching over icy gravel. The man stood there, unsure of what to do next. Go home? Call someone? He didn't even know the girl's name. All he knew was the gnawing feeling in his gut, the sense that something about this whole situation was off. Kids didn't just wander into the woods alone. Not in weather like this. Not without someone looking for them. His eyes drifted to the dog. It hadn't moved, still staring down the road where the ambulance had disappeared. "You're not just a stray, are you?" the man muttered, crouching beside the dog. He ran his fingers through the thick fur, now thawing and damp. There was a collar buried beneath the matted hair, no tags, just worn leather, frayed at the edges. You had a home once. A family. Is she your family? The dog's ears flicked, but it didn't break its gaze from the distant lights now fading into the snowy horizon. The man sighed, standing up and dusting snow off his knees. All right, boy. Or girl. Whatever you are. Looks like you're sticking with me for now. He glanced back at his car, engine still running, exhaust curling into the cold air. His evening plans, dinner, television, maybe falling asleep in his recliner, felt impossibly far away now. There was no walking away from this. Not anymore. Come on, he said, patting his thigh. Let's figure out what the hell's going on here. The dog didn't hesitate. It trotted to his side, falling into step like they'd done this 1,000 times before. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Too quiet. The man kept glancing at the dog curled up in the passenger seat, head resting on its paws, eyes half-lidded but never fully closing. Every few minutes, it would lift its head, ears twitching, like it was listening for something only it could hear. You're not just some random stray, the man muttered, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. You knew where she was. You waited. Like you were, guarding her. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Not from the cold, but from something deeper. Fear. Real fear. Because if the dog had been guarding her, it meant there was something to guard against. The hospital came into view, its lights harsh and fluorescent against the dark sky. The man pulled into the nearest parking spot and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, heart pounding in his chest. All right, he said finally, voice rough. Let's go. The dog jumped out as soon as the door opened, landing lightly on the salted pavement. Together, they crossed the lot, boots crunching on ice, paws silent and sure. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. The man stomped snow off his boots and approached the front desk, the dog sticking close to his side. I'm here about the girl, he said quickly, leaning on the counter. The one they just brought in. Found her in the woods. I need to know if she's okay. The receptionist blinked, clearly caught off guard by the urgency in his tone, and the large dog standing obediently beside him. One moment, sir. She tapped at her keyboard, glancing between the screen and the dog like she couldn't decide which was more unusual. After a moment, she nodded. She's stable. Mild hypothermia, dehydration, a few scrapes and bruises. But she's awake. The man sagged with relief. Can I see her? Just for a minute. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded toward the far hallway. Room 214. But only for a moment. Family hasn't been located yet. Family. The word echoed in the man's mind as he walked down the sterile corridor, the dog padding silently beside him. Where was her family? The girl was sitting up when he entered the room, propped against stiff white pillows. Her cheeks were still too pale, her eyes wide and shadowed with exhaustion. But she was awake. Alive. That was enough. The dog trotted to the bed immediately, tail wagging in slow, deliberate sweeps. The girl's face lit up. You found her, the man murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He stepped closer, voice soft. Hey, kiddo. You gave us all a scare out there. The girl blinked at him, her small fingers curling into the dog's fur. She didn't speak. Just held on, like the dog was the only thing tethering her to safety. Do you have a name? The man asked gently. Anyone we can call? Your parents? At that, the girl flinched. Barely, but enough for the man to notice. The dog growled softly, not at the man, but at the word itself. Parents. The man's stomach sank. What the hell happened out there? All right, he said, voice steady. No rush. You're safe now. No one's gonna hurt you. The girl met his gaze for the first time. Her lips parted, voice hoarse and cracked from the cold. "Hiding," she whispered. The man froze. "What?" The girl swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward the window, where snow still fell in thick, lazy flakes. "We were hiding," she rasped. "Me and Shadow." The dog, Shadow, apparently, whined softly, pressing its nose into the girl's hand. "Hiding from who?" the man asked, heart pounding in his ears. The girl's gaze flicked to the door. And then she whispered the word that made the world tilt sideways. "Him." The man's breath caught. Every instinct screamed at him to ask more, to press for details, to understand. But the look in the girl's eyes, the raw, unfiltered terror, held him back. Not now. Not here. She was safe for the moment. That had to be enough. The dog, Shadow, stood guard beside the bed, muscles taut beneath thick fur. It didn't move, didn't blink, like it knew danger wasn't far behind. The man took a slow step back, mind racing. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something darker. Something worse. He pulled out his phone, fingers numb despite the warmth of the hospital. Time to call the police. Again. Because someone had been looking for this girl. And not the kind of someone you wanted finding her first. The man stood frozen, phone in hand, the girl's whispered word echoing in his mind. Him. Shadow, the dog, remained by the girl's side, eyes fixed on the door like it expected someone to burst through any second. The man glanced at the child, noticing how her tiny fingers gripped the fur tighter, as though the dog was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Okay," the man said quietly, forcing his voice to stay calm. "You're safe now. Nobody's getting to you here. Not with all these people around." The girl didn't look convinced. Her eyes flicked between the window and the door, and she shrank deeper into the hospital bed. Whatever, or whoever, she'd been running from still haunted her. The man stepped into the hallway, phone pressed to his ear as he dialed the police. The line clicked, and a tired-sounding dispatcher answered. "This is about the girl found in the woods," the man said, voice sharp with urgency. "She's awake. She said she was hiding from someone. You need to get someone here now." There was a pause, the sound of keys clacking in the background. "Sir, we already sent officers to search the area where you found her. There was no sign of anyone else." "Search again," the man snapped. "You don't understand. She's scared. This wasn't just a kid getting lost on a hike. Something happened out there." The dispatcher hesitated, then sighed. "All right, I'll send a unit to the hospital and another to sweep the woods. Stay put." The man hung up and rubbed a hand down his face. The hospital hallway felt too quiet, too exposed. He turned back toward the room, heart thudding in his chest. Inside, the girl hadn't moved. Shadow sat like a statue, ears perked, tail still. The man stepped closer, crouching beside the bed. "Can you tell me more, kiddo?" he asked gently. "Who's him? Someone you know?" The girl's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, shaking her head fiercely. Too scared to talk. That spoke volumes. "All right," the man said, voice soft. "You don't have to say anything right now. But I promise you, whoever it is, they're not getting past me. Or Shadow." At the sound of its name, the dog's tail gave a single, slow wag. Almost like it understood the promise. Time crawled. Nurses came and went, checking the girl's vitals, asking routine questions she barely answered. The man stayed close, arms crossed, eyes flicking to every shadow that stretched too far across the floor. Then, something small but chilling happened. Shadow stood up. No sound, no warning. 1 second it was resting by the bed, the next, it was on its feet, ears pricked forward, nose twitching. It moved to the door and stood there, body tense, like a guard blocking the entrance. The girl's eyes widened. She sat up straighter, her breathing quickening. The man's stomach dropped. He didn't hear anything, didn't see anything unusual. but the dog's reaction was unmistakable. "Stay here," he muttered, stepping toward the door. He peeked into the hallway. Empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow on the linoleum. The nurse's station at the far end was quiet, the receptionist flipping through papers without a care in the world. "Everything all right, sir?" a nurse asked, walking by with a clipboard. The man hesitated. "You see anyone hanging around? Someone who doesn't belong?" The nurse frowned. "No. Just staff and visitors." "Why?" "Shadow doesn't like something," he muttered, glancing back at the dog, still standing guard. The nurse smiled faintly, clearly humoring him. "Dogs get spooked sometimes. Could be a scent or..." Shadow growled. Low. Deep. The kind of sound that raised every hair on the back of the man's neck. It wasn't random. It was focused. The girl whimpered, shrinking back against the pillows. "All right, that's enough for me," the man muttered. He stepped into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him. His heart pounded as he scanned the corridor. Nothing looked out of place, but the dog's reaction couldn't be ignored. A figure rounded the corner at the far end of the hallway. A man, bundled in a dark coat, head down, moving quickly but not running. Like he didn't want to draw attention. The man's gut twisted. Was that? "Hey," he called out, stepping forward. "You looking for someone?" The figure didn't answer. Didn't even pause. Just kept walking, disappearing around the next corner without a glance back. The man swore under his breath. His first instinct was to chase, but he couldn't leave the girl. Not now. He ducked back into the room. Shadow hadn't moved, still standing like a sentry, eyes locked on the door. "Okay, kid," the man said, voice tight. "We're not waiting around to see what happens next." He grabbed the girl's coat from the chair, wrapping it around her small frame. She didn't resist, just clung to Shadow's fur as the man scooped her up. "We're getting out of here," he muttered, eyes darting to the window. It was a long drop, 2 stories, but the parking lot was below. His car wasn't far. The girl looked up at him, eyes wide and trusting. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. Anywhere was better than here. They slipped into the stairwell, the man moving fast but quiet, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Shadow trotted beside them, silent and sure-footed. "Hang in there, kid," the man murmured, tightening his grip on the girl. "Just a little longer." They reached the exit without incident. The freezing air hit them like a slap, but the man barely noticed. His car was parked under a flickering streetlight, dusted with fresh snow. Shadow paused at the door, sniffing the air. The dog's ears twitched, head swiveling toward the far end of the lot. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No figures lurking in the shadows. Still, the man didn't waste time. He unlocked the car, shoved the girl into the back seat, and snapped the seatbelt around her. Shadow jumped in after her, curling up protectively. The man slid into the driver's seat, hands shaking as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he threw the car into reverse, tires skidding on the icy pavement. As they sped away from the hospital, the girl finally spoke. "He was there," she whispered, voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "In the hallway." The man's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't ask how she knew. He believed her. Shadow whined softly, pressing closer to the girl. "Guarding. Always guarding." They drove in silence, the man's mind racing. He couldn't take her home, not if she was hiding from someone dangerous. The police? Maybe. But whoever he was had slipped past security once. Who's to say it wouldn't happen again? The girl shivered in the back seat, her breath fogging the window. "Where are we going?" she asked finally, voice small. The man glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Somewhere safe. I promise." Shadow lifted its head, eyes meeting the man's. There was understanding there, deeper than instinct. Almost like the dog knew the stakes better than either of them. The man didn't know who the girl was running from, but one thing was clear. They weren't stopping until they found answers. And until then, he'd protect her, no matter what. The car's heater hummed quietly, struggling to push warmth into the icy cabin. Outside, snowflakes swirled under flickering streetlights, casting restless shadows on the pavement. The man's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. His eyes flicked between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, where the girl sat, wrapped in the oversized coat, her arms around Shadow's neck. The dog hadn't stopped watching the road behind them. Its ears twitched at every passing car, every set of headlights that got too close. It wasn't just guarding the girl, it was guarding both of them now. The man didn't know what this dog had been through before, but it had clearly learned the difference between safety and danger. "Do you have somewhere we can go?" the girl asked, voice barely above a whisper. She was staring out the window, her face pale under the glow of the dashboard lights. The man hesitated. His apartment was out of the question. If whoever he was had already tracked her to the hospital, it meant they were dealing with someone resourceful and relentless. There was only one place that came to mind, somewhere off the grid, quiet and safe. "My uncle's old cabin," he said finally. "Nobody's been there for years, but it's still standing. Out by the lake. No neighbors, no streetlights. Just trees and snow." The girl nodded slowly, her gaze distant. It was like she'd already learned not to ask too many questions, not to get her hopes up about safety. The man's chest tightened at the thought. No kid should have to think like that. Shadow gave a soft, reassuring chuff and laid its head in the girl's lap. She stroked its ears absent-mindedly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. They drove for hours, leaving the city lights behind and trading slick highways for winding country roads. The snow thickened, blanketing everything in white silence. The world seemed to shrink to the narrow beam of the headlights, stretching through the dark like a fragile lifeline. The girl dozed off eventually, curled up under the coat, one hand still tangled in Shadow's fur. The man kept driving, jaw clenched, mind racing. Who was she running from? And why did Shadow, the dog that had once been freezing and helpless, seem so fiercely devoted to protecting her? It didn't add up. Dogs didn't just bond like that overnight. Unless... The man frowned, memories clicking into place. When he'd first found the dog, there'd been no collar, no tags. Just matted fur, ribs showing through thin skin. But the way Shadow had taken to the girl, like it knew her, suggested they'd crossed paths before. Had they escaped together? Had the dog been searching for her all along? His thoughts were interrupted by a flash of movement in the rearview mirror. Headlights. Far back, barely more than pinpricks in the distance, but steady. Following. The man's stomach dropped. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath, pressing the gas pedal a little harder. The old truck grumbled but obeyed, tires crunching through the fresh snow. The girl stirred in the back seat. Shadow lifted its head, ears alert. The dog didn't growl this time, but its eyes stayed locked on the mirror, as if it, too, had sensed the danger. "We're almost there," the man said, more to himself than anyone else. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow, unplowed road, half hidden by tall pines, and draped in silence. The man hadn't been here in years, not since his uncle passed. The place was cold, creaky, and smelled faintly of old wood and forgotten memories. But it was shelter. And it was safe, for now. He killed the headlights before turning down the final stretch, easing the truck through the snow until the cabin loomed out of the darkness. The headlights in the distance didn't follow. After a tense moment, they flickered out entirely. "Whoever it was, they didn't see us turn," the man muttered, relief washing over him. He parked close to the cabin, jumping out to unlock the door while Shadow leapt down, staying close to the girl's side. The dog moved like a soldier on patrol, silent, focused, protective. Inside, the cabin was cold but dry. The man lit the old wood stove, warmth slowly creeping into the room. The girl stood quietly in the corner, hugging herself, eyes darting around like she expected the walls to cave in any second. "You're safe here," the man said softly. "Nobody knows this place. Not even the cops." The girl nodded but didn't speak. Shadow curled up beside her, pressing its warm body against her legs. Later, after the girl had fallen asleep on the old couch under a mountain of blankets, the man sat by the window, staring out at the snow-covered road. His mind kept circling back to the same question: who was chasing her? And why? He glanced at Shadow, who lay with its head on the girl's lap, eyes half closed but ears still flicking at every sound. That dog wasn't just a pet. It was a guardian, a survivor. Maybe even a witness. The man leaned back with a sigh. He'd protect them both. No matter what. But deep down, he knew the peace wouldn't last. People like him didn't just give up. Sure enough, the peace shattered just before dawn. Shadow woke first, head snapping up, body tense. A low growl rumbled in its throat, sharp enough to jolt the man awake. "Stay here," the man whispered to the girl, grabbing the flashlight and stepping onto the porch. The forest was still, snow falling in soft flakes. No footprints. No movement. But Shadow wouldn't stop growling, its gaze locked on the tree line. Then he saw it, something small and dark, half buried in the snow. A cell phone, screen cracked, still faintly glowing. His heart pounded. Someone had been here. Watching. Waiting. The man stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. He didn't need to wake the girl to know the truth. They'd been found. The man stood frozen in the doorway, the cracked phone lying half buried in the snow just beyond the porch steps. His breath hung in the cold air, heart pounding in his chest. Someone had been here. Watching. Waiting. Shadow stood beside him, growl fading into tense silence, but its body remained rigid, ears pricked forward, tail low. The dog's focus didn't waver from the tree line, as though expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows at any moment. The man slowly backed inside, locking the door behind him and sliding the deadbolt into place. His mind raced. How long had the watcher been out there? And more importantly, why hadn't they come closer? The girl was still curled up on the couch, blanket pulled to her chin, face peaceful in sleep. She looked so small, so fragile, like she hadn't truly rested in weeks. The sight made his chest tighten. He couldn't wake her, not yet. Not until he had a plan. The man knelt beside Shadow, running a hand down the dog's tense back. "What do you think, boy? Are they gone? Or are they just waiting for us to slip up?" Shadow didn't move. It didn't need to. The answer was clear. They were still out there. The next few hours crawled by, the man pacing the room while Shadow stood watch by the window. The girl stirred once or twice, but didn't fully wake. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the cabin in a deceptive kind of peace. Finally, just as the first pale light of dawn touched the sky, the man made a decision. They couldn't stay here. If someone had tracked them this far, it meant the cabin wasn't the safe haven he'd hoped for. He had no idea how long the girl had been running or what she'd escaped from, but one thing was clear: they had to keep moving. He crouched beside the couch, gently shaking the girl's shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and fearful, until she recognized his face. "Time to go, kid," he said softly. "It's not safe here anymore." She sat up quickly, glancing around the room like she expected to see danger lurking in every corner. "Did he find us?" The man hesitated. "I don't know. But I'm not waiting around to find out." The girl nodded, already reaching for her coat. She didn't ask questions, didn't complain about the early hour or the cold. It was the reaction of someone who'd been running long enough to know that hesitation could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Shadow trotted to the door without being told, tail low, eyes sharp. The man didn't need to leash him, the dog moved like it understood the stakes perfectly. The drive back down the snow-covered road was slow and tense. The man kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting headlights to appear around every bend. But the road remained empty, the forest silent and white. "Where are we going now?" the girl asked quietly from the back seat, her arms wrapped around Shadow, who sat pressed against her side like a furry shield. The man sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Someplace no one would think to look. I've got a friend who runs an old motel off the highway. It's not fancy, but it's warm and it's quiet. We'll figure out our next move from there." The girl nodded, though the worry never left her eyes. "He won't stop, you know. Not until he finds me." The man gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't." The motel sat on the edge of a forgotten highway, the kind of place people passed without noticing. Faded signs, peeling paint, a handful of rusted cars in the parking lot. Perfect for disappearing. The man's friend, an older woman with sharp eyes and a soft heart, didn't ask questions when they checked in. She took one look at the girl's tired face, the dog standing protectively by her side, and handed over a key. "Room 7, she said quietly. "End of the row. Nobody'll bother you there." "Thanks," the man muttered, slipping her a few crumpled bills. "If anyone comes asking." "I didn't see a thing," she finished with a knowing nod. The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a heater that rattled but worked. The girl sat on the edge of one bed, pulling her knees to her chest, while Shadow curled up at her feet. The man dropped into the chair by the window, watching the parking lot through the gap in the curtain. For the first time in what felt like days, there was quiet. No footsteps in the snow. No flickering headlights. Just the soft hum of the heater and the girl's slow, steady breathing. But peace didn't last long. Late that night, the girl finally opened up. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was trust, slowly built through shared fear and quiet protection. Either way, the words came out in a halting, broken whisper. He wasn't supposed to find me," she murmured, staring at the worn carpet. "I thought we got away for good." The man leaned forward. "We? You mean you and Shadow?" She nodded, running her fingers through the dog's thick fur. "He was his dog. Back when, before everything got bad. But Shadow never liked him. He'd growl, hide under the table whenever he got angry." The man's stomach twisted. He didn't need to hear more to understand what kind of life the girl had been running from. "One night," she continued, voice barely audible, "he got mad. Really mad. I don't even remember why. But Shadow jumped between us. He bit him. Hard. I thought." Her throat closed up, and she buried her face in her hands. "I thought he'd kill Shadow. I thought I'd never see him again." The man glanced at the dog, who lay quietly at her feet, eyes watchful and steady. It all made sense now, the bond, the fear, the determination. Shadow hadn't just been a stray. He'd been a survivor. Just like the girl. "So you ran," the man said softly. She nodded. "Shadow found me a few days later. I don't know how, but he did. And we've been running ever since." The man's jaw tightened. He looked out the window, into the dark parking lot, and made a silent promise. They weren't running anymore. Not if he could help it. The next morning, while the girl slept, the man stepped outside to call the police again. He wasn't taking chances, not this time. But as the phone rang, something caught his eye. A single set of footprints in the snow, leading up to the window of their room. Fresh. Deep. Like someone had stood there for a long time, watching. The man's blood ran cold. Whoever he was, he'd found them again. And this time, the man wasn't going to wait for him to make the first move. The man stared at the footprints in the snow, heart pounding. They led straight to the window of room 7, where the girl and Shadow were still sleeping. Whoever had been there hadn't knocked, hadn't tried to break in, they'd just watched. A cold realization settled over him. This wasn't just about running anymore. It was about ending this, once and for all. He stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. The girl stirred, blinking sleepily. Shadow was already awake, sitting upright with ears pricked forward. The dog knew something was wrong. "Get your shoes on," the man said quietly. "We're leaving. Now." The girl sat up, alarmed. What happened? Footprints. Someone was watching the window. Her face paled. Without another word, she slipped into her coat and boots, Shadow never leaving her side. The man grabbed the truck keys, but another idea was already forming in his mind, one that didn't involve more running. It ends here. Instead of heading for the truck, the man led them around the back of the motel, through the narrow alley, behind the rows of rooms. He kept low, one hand on the girl's shoulder, the other on Shadow's collar. The dog moved silently, every muscle taut. "Where are we going?" the girl whispered. "To the front desk. My friend has security cameras. If someone's been hanging around, they'll be on the footage." They slipped into the office through the back door, where the older woman was already sipping coffee behind the counter. She looked up, eyes narrowing at their tense expressions. "Footprints," the man muttered. "By the window." Without hesitation, she turned the monitor toward him, clicking through the night's recordings. The grainy footage flickered on the screen, empty parking lot, falling snow, nothing unusual. Until 3:17 a.m. A dark figure moved into frame, hood pulled low, face obscured. They walked straight to room 7, standing just outside the window for what felt like forever. The person didn't move, didn't knock, just watched. Then, without warning, they turned and disappeared into the tree line. The girl gripped Shadow's fur, knuckles white. The man's jaw tightened. "That's him," she whispered. "I know it is." The motel owner glanced between them, face hardening. "Call the cops?" The man hesitated. "They've been here before. Reports filed. Promises made. Nothing done." This time, he needed more than a report. He needed proof, something that would make the authorities listen. "No," he said finally. "But I need a favor." An hour later, the trap was set. The girl and Shadow sat in the truck, parked a few blocks away, with the motel owner keeping watch. The man stood just inside room 7, lights off, curtain cracked. He didn't have to wait long. At sunrise, the figure returned. The man's heart pounded as the hooded shape emerged from the trees, moving cautiously across the snow-covered parking lot. The person paused near the window, like they were checking for signs of life inside. But this time, the man was ready. He stepped out onto the porch, gun holstered but visible, phone raised, already recording. "Looking for someone?" the man called, voice sharp. The figure froze. For a split second, the hood fell back, revealing a gaunt, angry face, eyes wild, teeth clenched. It was him. The man hunting the girl. "She's gone," the man continued, stepping forward. "And you're done." The figure glanced toward the truck down the road, then back at the man. His eyes narrowed, weighing his chances. "You can walk away," the man warned, voice low and steady. "Or you can spend the rest of your life explaining this to the cops. Your choice." For a moment, it seemed like the man might charge, rage boiling under the surface. But then, perhaps realizing he was outmatched, he took a step back. Then another. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees once more. The man exhaled slowly, lowering the phone. This time, he had footage. This time, the police would have no choice but to act. By noon, officers were at the motel, reviewing the video and taking statements. The girl sat quietly on the tailgate of the truck, Shadow leaning against her side. For the first time since they'd met, she didn't look afraid. Just tired. But safe. The man crouched beside her. "It's over, kid. They'll find him now. He won't be able to come near you again." She looked up at him, eyes searching his face. "Do you really think it's over?" He nodded. "Yeah. I do." The girl hesitated, then threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Shadow pressed in, tail wagging for the first time in days. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." The police found the man hiding in an abandoned cabin 2 miles away, half frozen and out of options. He was taken into custody without incident. With the video evidence and the girl's testimony, there'd be no easy way out for him this time. The girl, now officially safe, was placed with a family that specialized in helping kids escape dangerous situations. The man checked in often, always finding her laughing with Shadow, her face brighter with each visit. One day, as they stood by the truck after a check-in, the girl looked up at him, smiling softly. "You didn't have to help," she said. "But you did." The man shrugged. "Sometimes, life gives you a choice, to walk away or to stand up." "I'm just glad I stood up." She nodded, eyes shining. "Me too."